next speaker is Alex Kuhnast. Alex heads up KPMG's actuarial consulting practice, and he's involved in various industry bodies, our working groups and actuarial bodies. We're actually really fortunate that Alex chose to take the role in June this year, coming from KPMG in South Africa. And our risks are interconnected. We do know that, and the global pandemic with Russia and Ukraine, war amongst other recent events, has really further highlighted this. Alex will discuss how the risk environment has changed and some approaches to identifying and managing risks in that increasingly uncertain global environment that Peter talked so kindly to us about. So thank you, Alex.
Thanks very much. I think we've heard some really interesting talks so far this morning. And I think one thing that definitely permeates and definitely strikes me, even though some of the topics are quite diverse, going from ESG to D&O cover, etc., is certainly that a lot of the changes in these spaces are driven by interconnected risks. So hopefully a relevant topic. Okay, so yes, my name is Alex and I'm an actuary. I think there's probably some more addicts, I mean actuaries around. I don't know if there's any in the room. No, good, so I can make it up as I go. If I say anything that's ridiculous, no. But I think certainly what we're seeing, and as already mentioned, there's just a range of risks out there. And what we've started to see is just that these risks are really moving at a faster pace and starting to really influence each other in more ways than what we've seen historically. So as a business, we have to deal with rapid change and really figure out ways to manage these risks whilst maintaining focus on where the business needs to go. I'm a little bit disappointed that those blinds have been closed, simply because I think all of us as individuals have also faced exposure and realized just how interrelated risks are these days. I think historically we used to be able to sit in an ivory tower in a bubble and just model risks. But I think certainly having just recently arrived in the country, the reason I wanted to look outside was just really to see if my container had maybe finally made it. So at the top of that slide, I've got a range of 10 risks that had been identified by the World Economic Forum participants. And what you can see is certainly all of those are interrelated. A lot of them will feed through to one another. I mean, climate action failure, extreme weather, etc., they all lead on to other risks that you as managers, risk managers, business execs, etc., have to manage. So what I'm going to talk about is a little bit of where we've come as a quantitative profession in terms of managing risks, what actuaries actually do, but also just where and how we can start thinking about risks and the interconnectedness of risks a little bit differently and perhaps manage them slightly differently. I'll also cover touch on a tool that KPMG has developed, but not for the purposes of really exposing you to the tool itself, but more to some of the thinking behind that tool. And perhaps you can take some of those thoughts back with you to how you manage your risks within your business. So as I mentioned, I am an actuary, and generally we would model risks quantitatively. So what does an actuary do? We've got a little bubble up there saying that hopefully we don't actually go on strike at some point, because then somebody might actually have to figure out what this little guy sitting in the back office corner actually does. Some quotes at maybe, yeah, yes, we look at black boxes. Are we psychics or are we just making it all up? Are we sitting there calculating your life expectancy? And I think what also comes to the fore is often you can answer the question in many different ways. But I think maybe if you want to test yourself whether you might have some propensity to become an actuary, here are some of the common traits that will maybe give you a little bit more of a background as to what an actuary does. So if somebody asked that rhetorical question of what are the odds? Well, yeah, we might actually know the answer. Although I'll touch on maybe we don't. But the fact is, yes, a lot of statistics underpin the work that actuaries and those in the quantitative statistical fields generally get involved in. So if your friends always ask you how to calculate the tips at the restaurant, not just stats, but supposedly pretty good with maths. If you have an opinion about calculators, yes, black boxes. So that's something that is really a criticism of the quantitative risk management fields often is these things are calculators sitting as black boxes that management doesn't always really understand and not potentially well communicated by those that are operating these. In terms of if you've ever discovered an error on a bill or a bank statement, they actually might have gone back to you and talked you through it. So there's another key principle is that communication aspect and really how can we communicate better in terms of what's going on in these black boxes. Friends, family having trouble to explain what you actually do. So certainly my wife, I don't think after 16 years, she actually knows what I do. I remember when I was studying, the UK actuarial profession was kind enough to create these little sound casts that you could put on your iPod just to revise certain notes. And at one point, my wife came back after a day out and she'd been listening to her music on her iPod. She said she couldn't figure out why she was feeling so tired and why she kept falling asleep. We went through her playlist. It turns out one of my actuarial sound casts had slipped into her. And then obviously, if you yourself have trouble explaining what it is you do, then you might well. So let me just go into what an actuary does according to the UK Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. We've got their problem solvers and strategic thinkers. So certainly that's often why actuaries are called in, is to really solve some or other form of problem, but not only on a micro level, but also on a strategic level. Hopefully, but I think that's where perhaps sometimes we've let ourselves short is not really linking into the strategic thinking. Yes, mathematical skills, we mentioned statistics, probability of future risk and future of risks of future events, predict the financial impact of these events. Yes, quite important given what we're talking about at the moment. And those ideally will help businesses model and plan for the future. Interestingly enough, I see the UK Institute and Faculty has a little link there. You'll see on the bottom right of that description actually asking for an online personality test. So on the one hand, either they think we don't have personalities or perhaps they think there is a personality. And I couldn't help but add in the slide. I mean, someone actually, an actuary from the Aussie Institute of Actuaries actually took the time to present a personality types of actuaries paper at one of the historic conventions. Might seem a bit random, I couldn't leave it off, but it will come back a little bit to the topic when we talk about how best to actually manage risks. And perhaps we need to be involving a slightly wider type of person and consulting a little bit more widely when we are formulating how risks interact with one another. I prefer this definition though. So yes, manages risks, great. So maybe I'm in the right room then. Analyzing data from the past and present. So certainly this is the core of what a lot of quantitative actuarial techniques, but not only quantitative actuarial, but quantitative risk management techniques rely on. They take past data and then try to predict what's going to happen in the future. Now that's all fun and well as long as the past represents the future. Yes, we do try to take into account analysis and information from present and change those predictions accordingly. But a lot of financial and economic theory was actually developed during the Bretton Woods period, where the world was fairly benign, the level of interaction between countries was fairly limited. So a lot of that has actually been invalidated. But quite important also determining the likelihoods of scenarios happening. So scenarios certainly are critical in finding ways to reduce the risks. And then obviously the financial cost as well. So some of that will come into play, especially when you're looking at things like what Corey discussed in terms of ESG, some of the climate standards require you to start running some scenarios, identify opportunities and risks, and try and quantify the impacts for your business. Some useful skill sets there. But as I mentioned, historically, what have we done as actuaries and quantitative risk managers? We've taken historic data and we've extrapolated that forward. But increasingly, what are we seeing in the world? We're seeing these interconnected risks. We've seen risks that are manifesting a lot quicker and also manifesting in ways that historically they have not been reverted and historically perhaps manifested differently. So perhaps some of these methods are no longer appropriate. Perhaps maybe we're getting stuck a little bit too much in the detail, a little bit too much in the modeling and the numbers, and perhaps there's more value to be gained from the process itself. Let's talk a little bit about risk connectivity. So we're now sitting in an environment where risks are interacting with one another at an increasingly interconnected experience and at a pace that surpasses that observed historically. So certainly agree with the first speaker when he mentioned that not really sure whether it's just that we reporting more and actually seeing more events being reported on, but I think that somehow promulgates throughout the connected network as well. So people react to news. But if you look at the insurance data, if you look at the claims coming through, you certainly see there does seem to be an increased trend in abnormal events, in abnormal claim events. And what that proposes is a challenge to those trying to manage the risks. So these type 1 risks, which we historically managed quite well by just simply extrapolating that historic data, those no longer seem to be the predominant ones that are causing the concern and the damage to institutions. We're now faced with more type 2 type risks, and these are ones where the paradigm has shifted. So if we think of things like COVID, I mean, quite obviously that's changed a lot of things in our worlds. We look at the financial crisis, we look at Brexit. These aren't mean reverting risks. These are type 2 type risks where the whole paradigm of how the world operates going forward has shifted. Even certain cyber breaches that were touched on earlier, these are abnormal. These are things that we haven't necessarily been able to plan for in the past. So how best do we then go about generating that data, that quality of insight so that we can actually manage those risks? We'll take a little bit of a look at some potential strategies there. But basically what I think a potential way is starting to look at our risk registers and starting to consider a few more dimensions, not just the two-dimensional likelihood and severity type of risk registers, but starting to look a little bit beyond that, starting to identify the risks that trigger multiple other risks within the network of risks. What you might start seeing is that risks that traditionally sat on the upper right quadrant of this likelihood and severity type risk maps may not be the ones that are triggering the highest aggregate losses. It might actually be a combination of risks that influence each other sitting elsewhere within that risk network that might actually be acting together. One topples onto the next one, that domino effect, that is actually causing a greater aggregate loss event than an isolated risk event sitting on the upper right. The other dimension, the fourth dimension that we could possibly be bringing into focus a little bit more is that of speed or velocity of onset of risks. So some risks will promulgate and basically invade at a far quicker pace than certain other risks. We saw that, I think COVID is a great example. So a lot of the impacts that were felt by COVID were felt pretty quickly. We saw the markets crash pretty much overnight, but it wasn't just that. We had employees now having to work from home, et cetera, et cetera. Contrast that to perhaps something like the climate type risk, which is a little bit more longer term and proposes challenges of its own. So I'm going to propose perhaps one method of improving the quality of data that we can use to identify not necessarily black swan events, although some might propose that even those can be identified. But by just to basically broaden our risk universe and really start focusing on identifying the connections between those risks and adding to those 4 dimensions as well as the speed, and not just looking at only the likelihood and severity of risk events. So just quickly, just summarizing what I'm sure many of you already know, some basic qualitative methods to start thinking a little bit more broadly around which risks your organization might be exposed to. So we've got what keeps you up at night. I think most of us have heard about that, asking the execs, the heads of departments, really what are they worried about? Workshops, and that's one where I'll touch on a little bit more for the rest of the talk. Really starting to elicit from a wider group of operational managers and experts in their field where they see the risks lying, what's worrying them. Possibly looking back at the organization itself's history, where it's experienced operational losses or near misses. We can always learn from the past. Obviously, as I pointed out, it's not always going to be a predictor of the future. But certainly looking back at COVID, I'm sure many businesses have taken away some key lessons that they could use going forward. Then we've got horizon scanning, looking at competitors, looking at other similar businesses. What losses or what events have they experienced recently? And how can we learn from that going forward? And then, of course, there's just consulting with specialists in a particular area. There's often a fair bit of research around key risks. We've heard some of it already discussed. So in terms of this expert elicitation, it's been shown to be useful for the identification of future scenarios, specifically where there is an absence of tangible historic data. By way of an example, so those of you that work in the financial services space, specifically under risk-based capital regimes, a while ago, so coming from an insurance background around 2010, there was a lot of work being done around the Solvency II, risk-based solvency regulation to be implemented in European insurance markets. And one of those pillars or one of those core elements was something called an own risk and solvency assessment. And what the core there was the regulator asking to, well, under pillar 1, we've given you a set of calculations, push your data through that, out pops your regulatory capital requirement. But we recognize that this might not be appropriate to your business. So on a forward-looking basis, we want you as a business to assess and run some scenarios to understand, given your strategy, given what you want to do as a business, given your current risk profile, and given your capital position, how these 3 interrelate to one another, and come back to me and tell yourselves first of all, and then tell me as the regulator what your own capital needs are. So now this seems basic to me. This is something that I would expect all businesses to be doing, but in reality, what we see is there's often disjointed processes between strategy, risk management, and capital allocation or capital management. Taking that back to the COVID scenario and where we've seen perhaps expert elicitation or just consulting a little bit widely, we would have seen some better outcomes. So yes, we had this also requirement. And what we saw under these forward-looking projections, a lot of these companies already had a pandemic type scenario that they were considering. But across the board, I did not see a single scenario where any of these insurers had even remotely identified the number of interconnected risks that would hit those companies. So a lot of them, you would have had an actuary, maybe a couple of other people sitting around a table coming up with a scenario. As a life insurance company, they probably had a pandemic scenario. Not all of them did, surprisingly enough, but a lot of them did. But what would they have measured under that impact? They probably thought of mortality. Okay, mortality goes up, I measure mortality going up. Then I realized, hang on a second, these risks are interrelated. There's probably going to be some sort of impact on equity markets. I must be honest, the impacts they had foreseen were nowhere near what we saw March 2020 when the markets just took a deep dive. unfortunately, I think that was also kind of obvious. We all know people overreact. You've got something as major as a paradigm shift of something where everybody's locked down with some deadly virus out there, people react quickly. And I think you could have probably foreseen also that it's going to bounce pretty quickly. But if we looked backwards and looking from where we sit now, it seems kind of silly, kind of obvious. How could we not have identified that you've got a contagious disease out there as our scenario? It was already there, the pandemic scenario. How did you not understand that your staff can't be sitting shoulder to shoulder in the sweatshop, working next to each other with a contagious disease prevalent? So had those organizations consulted a little bit more widely with the experts in their fields, look around the exco table, gone to the HR representative while they're discussing the scenario and said, listen, we've got a pandemic here. What happens? What are the risks? And how does that impact your area of business? I guarantee you that HR representative would have said, I can't have my staff working next to each other with a disease floating around in the sky. Okay, great. Immediately, we've already recognized there's an operational impact here. Okay, so what do? We work from home. As soon as you mention that, I'm pretty sure your head of IT is going to stick his hand up and say, hang on a second. Firstly, where do we have all the infrastructure, the internet, the laptops, etc.? Hang on a second, cyber risk. So I think you can see where I'm going to. If we're just as organizations consulted a little bit more widely, and apparently there is peer-reviewed literature to prove that expert elicitation has really helped in identifying what some would say is black swan events, but not necessarily black swan events, but actually the interconnectedness and how risks topple one another. Certainly, if we'd gone back, and as insurance companies full of supposed experts, I'm pretty sure we would have done a far better job in identifying these related risks. From the non-life insurance space, I mean, we had some major issues with the business interruption type claims. Again, I mean, some of it was just risk exposure was just not fully understood. So there's some additional feed through learnings from that in terms of really transition risks and risks from moving operations within a business better. We'll tackle that in a separate session. Having had the opportunity also to not just sit in an actuarial and a technical seat, so I did also spend not only time in Africa, in Europe, in actuarial, in risk roles, but I've also had the opportunity to lead a business for 5 years. And that's quite an interesting change in mindset required from going from a more risk manager, risk mitigator type of role to now, hey buddy, you're in charge of growing this business. You can't just keep shutting everything down because the sales wheels need to keep churning. And when I started thinking about it, I mean, we've all heard this, that the flip side of risk is opportunity. And certainly I think when you can start identifying where the risks lie operationally within a business, you can also start identifying a fair few opportunities for the business itself. So I once took a strategic marketing course. And one point that struck me when I walked away from that, they'd come up with some learning that if you want to win as a business, you need to be at least good, as good as your competitors on 2 axes out of 3. We won't delve into what the axes were, but you need to be better than your competitors at least one of them. So if you were doing a brainstorming exercise with your various execs, etc., I guarantee you would identify some of these risks and having had various strategic sessions, your customer SWOT analysis, etc., you invariably come up with, and it was a little frustrating, a lot of risk events. You're sitting in a strategy session and everybody's coming up with, oh, but this could go wrong, or oh, we're weak here. But I think it's just interesting if you start really looking at the interconnected risks, etc., and start understanding what drives what, you'll start to identify where you've actually got opportunities to either backfill and fill up those gaps where you are lagging behind your competitors, but more importantly, to start understanding where you can start succeeding as a business. So that brings me on just to an operationalization of how we can start seeing these risks and how we can start portraying how they're connected to one another. So I'll delve a little bit into this dynamic risk assessment tool, which is a proprietary tool that was developed by KPMG. but not necessarily as a sales pitch, more just to show you what it looks like and how you can start thinking about these risks and not just theoretically, but what you do with it and what it looks like. So traditionally, we would have had something like this. You've got a severity and likelihood plot, you've consulted hopefully widely, and you've got a view. Your risk register has now been put on a two-dimensional pictogram. Historically, you would have been looking at those top right list risks and those would have had either that little red rating on your risk register. These are the ones we need to focus on, guys. But when you start looking at it as a network, you start to identify, as I mentioned, hang on a second, it's not necessarily those red risks sitting up at the top right there that are causing most of the damage. We need to start identifying which of these are clustering together, which of these are really going to start interacting with one another and at what speed, and then start identifying which of these risks we should be managing first and which are those that can be perhaps either delegated downwards within the organization or perhaps even accepted. So now we've identified via this tool, but you could probably do it via some other methods as well, which of the risks are related to one another. So we've got now a three-dimensional pictogram of how risks are related to one another. The bigger risks are the ones where we see higher impact. We've also got some little arrows that you'll see there pointing in towards risks and some pointing away. And what we start to identify is that some risks tend to be acceptors or what we would call receivers, and some risks that we would call emitters. And what's quite key when we start identifying risk emitters and risk receivers is we can start identifying which risks will topple over other risks. And if we start to identify those, well, I think we're already quite a ways forward in terms of identifying where we need to focus our efforts. Which ones are those contagious risks? On the other hand, we've got the receivers. So we need to understand also which risks will ultimately be impacted. So I guess what was missed in a lot of these COVID type scenario planning was which are the receivers, the ultimate receivers, the ones the second, third, fourth order impact risks. So when you're looking at climate scenarios, the same sort of thinking is probably worthwhile thinking through is ultimately which dominoes are toppled later on in that row of dominoes, and how can we then best manage those. So one of the slides I flicked over here quickly was just looking at how we then can identify these combinations of risks. And these are the ones that then we would focus on more in terms of that aggregate exposure, the ones that will be perhaps more prevalent and more severe in terms of should they arise, simply because not necessarily they're sitting in the upper right quadrant in terms of likelihood and severity, but combinations of risks. And what you often see is you'll identify even more than one cluster, and sometimes there's a key risk sitting in the middle that sits in 2 or 3 clusters, and those are particularly severe and important contagious risks that will probably then start getting a little bit more attention than perhaps where they were benignly sitting on your 2-dimensional risk map, probably somewhere in the middle. And lastly, what you probably also identify is you might have some risks sitting outside of these connected risks. So some of them will have really few levels of connectedness. Perhaps potentially in isolation, these are quite severe, but perhaps now they can be managed in a slightly different way. Some of them might actually end up being deemed to be non-significant risks. Risks that originally on our 2-dimensional map we were sitting upright or fairly high, and probably getting attention from you as risk managers or from the board, where perhaps they didn't really warrant that. So I guess in summary, and if I were to take a step backwards, looking at things like climate change, climate standards requiring a lot of you to start thinking through scenarios, I would encourage you to start thinking a little bit more along consideration of how risks are related to one another. Also the speed at which they might manifest, and perhaps worth considering the speed at which your organization can react to certain risks. So certain companies or organizations that are playing more in the long term and longer contracts, longer contracts well into the future, things like insurance, but any other sort of longer construction type commitments, etc. It's slightly different to those that can react a lot quicker, have maybe a shorter time horizon. I would also suggest that expert elicitation, as we suggested, is probably a good avenue to go to start really identifying where these risks are connected and how they're connected, as well as identifying what that means for the business. And then hopefully you can come up with something like a 4-dimensional or 3-dimensional view as to which risks are really those that you should be focusing your attention on. I've got on that slide also just that little point on connecting the risk to the strategy and the capital allocation. That's really something that I think is critical, that a lot of organizations are missing. A lot of those functions are operating a little bit too siloed. So I would certainly be linking these scenarios into the strategy setting, not necessarily looking at the ultimate outcome of the scenario. I don't think the value in a scenario is really in the modeling and in the number itself that pops out of what the financial impact is. It's more in identifying what moves that impact. That you can identify what are the key risk indicators that you can start managing as a business. And that's really, for me, the key takeaway there. So that's my fairly short story around the connectedness of risks. I think we've all come to realize that maybe there is something going on out there. Some people might still be ignoring it, but I think certainly it's worth starting to look in a few more dimensions at these risks.